The silk of the dress was a lie. It whispered against my skin, a soft, crimson promise of elegance and belonging, but it was a language I did not speak. Around me, the ballroom hummed with the practiced ease of old money and inherited power. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, was a suffocating cloud of polite laughter and murmured Korean. Every woman wore her jewels like armor, every man his suit like a uniform. And I, Amara, in my borrowed gown and glittering earrings, was a foreign object, a splash of inconvenient color in a meticulously composed painting. My husband, Kwon Jin-woo, stood a few feet away, a pillar of stillness in the swirling chaos of the party. He was speaking to a government minister, his head inclined just so, a picture of deference that fooled no one. No one in this room was fooled by anything. They all knew who he was. The chairman of a legitimate global logistics company who just happened to control the entire shipping underworld of Seoul. He moved like the room owed him space, and it paid its debt without question. His suit was a dark charcoal, a custom piece that made every other man in the room look like a boy playing dress-up. I could feel his awareness of me, a low, constant hum beneath the surface of his conversation. It was not warmth.
It was ownership.
A silent accounting of his most recent and most public acquisition. Our marriage was a contract, a strategic alliance. My father, a diplomat with dwindling influence and mounting debts, had offered the one thing Jin-woo's empire lacked, a flawless bridge into the Western circles he wished to conquer.
And me.
I was the seal on the deal. Pretty, educated, and with a skin tone that made it clear to everyone this was not a union of tradition, but of ambition. I had agreed because the alternative my father presented was unthinkable. I had agreed because I was a survivor. I took a delicate sip of champagne, the bubbles fizzing on my tongue, and let my eyes drift over the crowd. That is when I saw him. Blake Sterling, my ex-boyfriend, the man who represented the life I was supposed to have had. CEO of his father's tech firm by 25, with a smile as bright and empty as his promises. He was everything my father had wanted for me. Polished, American, and powerful in a way that didn't involve shadows and whispers. Seeing him here felt like a ghost walking through a wall. His eyes found mine across the sea of black ties and silk. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He excused himself from his group and started toward me, moving with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no. My stomach tightened. The champagne suddenly tasted sour. I glanced at Jin-woo. He was still with the minister, but his eyes were no longer on the man's face. They were on Blake, a flat, unreadable darkness that made the air around me grow cold. He had not moved a muscle, but the shift in his attention was as loud as a gunshot. Amara, Blake said, his voice a low drawl that used to make me feel special and now just made me feel small. He stopped in front of me, his cologne a cheap, cloying scent compared to the subtle note of cedar and smoke that clung to Jin-woo. I have to say, I never thought I'd see you in a place like this. Married, I hear. To him, he flicked his eyes toward Jin-woo, a dismissive, arrogant gesture. Blake, I said, my voice even. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me flustered. What are you doing in Seoul? Business. Sterling Tech is expanding. We're in talks with a few local partners. His eyes roamed over my dress, my bare shoulders, lingering in a way that felt like a violation. Red was always your color. Makes you look available. My hand tightened on my champagne flute. I'm not. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. Oh, come on. We both know what this is. You traded up. Found a richer daddy. I get it, but don't pretend you're happy. I know you. You're not cut out for this world. For him. You don't know anything about me, I said, the words clipped. I could feel it then, the weight of Jin-woo's gaze. It was a physical pressure on my back. He was watching, listening, waiting. Blake leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I know you cried for a week when I left. I know you used to dream about a house in the suburbs, not a gilded cage in Gangnam. What's he got you on, Amara? What kind of debt did your father get into this time? The truth of his words was a sharp, painful sting. But hearing it from his lips, coated in such venomous contempt, ignited a spark of fury in my chest. That's none of your business. It is my business when you embarrass yourself. And me, by extension. People know we were together. He reached out, his fingers brushing my arm. I flinched away as if burned. His smile faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. The real Blake. The one who hated being denied anything. Don't pull that princess act with me. I know exactly who you are under that expensive dress. Get your hands off me, I said, my voice low and shaking with a rage I hadn't felt in years. His face hardened. The pleasant mask of the charming CEO dissolved, revealing the petulant, cruel boy beneath. You forgot your place, Amara. You always were too proud for your own good. And then he slapped me. It wasn't a brutal hit, but it was deliberate. The crack echoed in a tiny bubble of silence around us, the sting sharp and hot against my cheek. The shock of it stole my breath. In the background, the orchestra played on, oblivious. A few heads turned, their eyes wide with scandalized curiosity, before quickly looking away. No one wanted to get involved. But someone was already involved. I didn't look at Blake. My eyes, wide and watering from the impact, lifted and found my husband. Jinwoo hadn't moved from his spot. He was still standing with the minister, who now looked pale and terrified. But everything about Jinwoo had changed. The air around him had frozen. His face was a mask of perfect, terrifying calm, but his eyes were black holes.
They were not looking at me.
They were fixed on Blake. It was a look of such profound, surgical coldness that it made the back of my neck prickle with fear. It was the look of a predator that has just identified its prey. He gave the minister a single, almost imperceptible nod of dismissal. The man practically fled. Then, Jinwoo started to move.
He didn't rush. He walked.
Each step was deliberate, silent, eating up the space between them. The low hum of the ballroom seemed to fade into a dull roar in my ears. The only thing that was real was the sight of my husband gliding through the crowd, a shark in a sea of unsuspecting fish. Blake, puffed up with his own pathetic victory, hadn't noticed yet. He was still glaring at me, a sneer on his lips. See, Blake hissed. That's what you get for disrespecting me. He finally turned then, sensing the sudden chill, and saw Jinwoo. My husband stopped directly in front of him, close enough that Blake had to crane his neck back slightly to meet his eyes. Jinwoo was not a large man, but his presence was absolute. He didn't just occupy space, he commanded it.
He didn't speak.
He simply looked at Blake. He looked at the hand Blake had used to strike me. Then he looked back at Blake's face. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself. Blake's bravado began to crumble, melting away under the silent, suffocating weight of Jinwoo's gaze. Do you know who I am? Blake stammered, falling back on his usual armor of money and status. I'm Blake Sterling of Sterling Tech. Jinwoo's expression did not change. His voice, when he finally spoke, was so quiet I barely heard it, but it cut through the air like a shard of glass. I know, he said. And in those two words, there was a universe of threat. He knew his name, his company, his history, his future. And he knew that future had just ended. Jinwoo lifted a hand, not quickly, but with a horrifying grace. He gently took my arm, his fingers cool against my skin, and pulled me a half step behind him, shielding me with his body. He never took his eyes off Blake. Enjoy your evening, Jinwoo said, the words a dismissal and a death sentence all at once. Two of his men I hadn't even seen in the room, materialized on either side of Blake. They were dressed in the same impeccable suits, their faces blank. They each took one of Blake's arms. The CEO's face went white with a fear so pure it was almost pitiable. He had finally belatedly understood. He had not slapped a diplomat's daughter. He had slapped a king's wife in the middle of his court. The car ride back to the penthouse was a study in silence. The slick leather of the Maybach's interior felt cold against my skin. The city lights of Seoul blurred into streaks of neon and gold as we sped along the Han River, but I saw none of it. My cheeks still throbbed, a dull, humiliating ache. But it was nothing compared to the storm of silence emanating from the man beside me. Jin-woo stared straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees. His knuckles were white. He hadn't said a word to me since he'd pulled me away from the party.
He hadn't even looked at me.
The air in the car was so thick with his controlled fury it felt hard to breathe. I didn't know if the anger was for Blake, or for me, for being the cause of such a public scene. In his world, control was everything. And tonight, for a few moments, he had lost it. When we arrived at the penthouse, he swept through the marble foyer without a word, shrugging out of his suit jacket and handing it to a waiting housekeeper who bowed and disappeared. I followed, my red dress feeling garish and loud in the minimalist expanse of white walls and black furniture. He went straight to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering cityscape. He stood with his back to me, his shoulders rigid, a dark silhouette against the lights of Gangnam. I should leave. Go to my own wing of the vast apartment, tend to the blooming bruise on my face, and pretend this night never happened. That was the smart thing to do. That was what the contract of our marriage dictated. We were partners in public, strangers in private. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot. I had seen something in his eyes tonight, something beyond the cold calculation of a mafia boss. It was a flicker of possession so fierce it bordered on personal. He finally spoke, his voice low, his reflection a faint ghost in the glass. He will not touch you again. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a statement of fact, like saying the sun will rise. I thought of his men leading Blake away, of the final, dawning horror in Blake's eyes. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that Blake Sterling was no longer a problem. He was an erased variable in a complex equation. "What did you do?" I whispered, the words barely audible. He turned from the window, and for the first time, he looked at me. His eyes raked over my face, lingering on the red mark on my cheek. A muscle jumped in his jaw. I protected what is mine. I'm not a possession, Jin-woo. I'm not one of your shipping containers or your nightclubs. The words were out before I could stop them, sharper than I intended. A flicker of something, surprise? Respect, crossed his face before it was gone. "No," he said, his voice softer now. "You are not." He walked toward the bar, his movements fluid and precise. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. He held one out to me. I hesitated, then took it. My fingers brushed his, and a jolt, small but unmistakable, went through me. He took a slow sip from his own glass, his eyes never leaving my face. "My first wife," he began, and the unexpected personal turn silenced any retort I had prepared. "Her name was Sohee. She was gentle,
Kind.
She did not belong in this world. My enemies knew that. They saw her as a vulnerability, a weakness they could exploit." He paused, swirling the whiskey in his glass. The ice clinked, the only sound in the room. They were right. She was my weakness. One day, a rival thought to send me a message. A public display of disrespect, much like tonight. Only it wasn't a slap. It was a car bomb. The air left my lungs. I stared at him, at the sudden, raw pain that shadowed his features. This was the wound, the one vulnerability he carried. The reason for the impenetrable walls, the absolute control. He wasn't just a monster, he was a man haunted by failure. "I was too late," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, which was somehow more devastating than tears. "I failed to protect her. I swore I would never make that mistake again. I swore I would never allow anyone to be vulnerable because of me." He looked at me then, and I understood. Our marriage wasn't just a business deal for him. It was a fortress. He had chosen me, a foreigner, an outsider with no ties to this world, because he thought he could keep me separate, safe, untouched by the violence that defined his life. And tonight, Blake had shattered that illusion. He had walked right into the fortress and laid a hand on me. He had proven that Jin-woo could fail again. His anger wasn't for me. It was for himself. It was the rage of a king whose defenses had been breached.
I made a choice then.
I could retreat to my room, maintain the distance our contract stipulated. Or I could stay. I could step across the invisible line that separated his world from mine. I walked over to him, took the whiskey glass from his hand, and set it down on the bar. Then, with a courage I didn't know I possessed, I reached up and gently touched the side of his face. His skin was warm. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, his eyes widening in surprise.
He was not a man who was touched.
"You didn't fail tonight," I said softly. "You were there." He stared down at me, his gaze intense, searching. He slowly lifted his own hand and his fingers hovered over my cheek, his touch so light it was barely there, tracing the edge of the mark Blake had left. It was the most tender gesture I had ever received from him. His thumb brushed my skin, and the world seemed to stop. The silence between us was no longer cold and empty. It was charged heavy with unspoken things. He was seeing me, really seeing me for the first time, not as a contract or a symbol, but as a woman. And I was seeing him, not as a monster, but as a man defined by a single, tragic loss. That was the moment everything changed. The next few days passed in a strange, tense quiet. Jin-woo was a ghost in the penthouse, consumed by calls in his office, his voice a low, dangerous murmur I could sometimes hear through the thick wood of the door. The incident at the party had sent ripples through the city's underworld. A public insult to Kwon Jin-woo's wife was not something that could be ignored. It was a test, a probe of his defenses. And his rivals were watching to see how he would respond. Blake Sterling had simply vanished. His company issued a statement about a sudden leave of absence. His social media went silent. I never asked what happened.
I didn't need to.
I knew he was a debt that had been paid in full. I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The charged moment between us in front of the window felt like a dream, a fissure in the reality of our arrangement. We'd returned to our separate orbits, but the gravity between us had changed. I would catch him watching me from across the room, his expression unreadable. I found myself listening for the sound of his footsteps in the hall. The shoe dropped on a Tuesday. I was being driven back from a charity luncheon, one of the few public duties my role required. The streets of Seoul were slick with rain, the sky a dull, gray sheet. Our black sedan moved smoothly through the traffic, a bubble of quiet luxury. I was looking out the window, watching the city lights smear across the wet glass, when the driver's head suddenly snapped to the side. At the same instant, a heavy black SUV swerved out of the adjacent lane, slamming into our side with a deafening screech of metal on metal. Our car spun, the tires screaming in protest. I was thrown against the door, my head cracking against the window. The world became a chaotic blur of motion and noise. The driver fought for control, but the SUV hit us again, harder this time, forcing us over the curb and onto the rain-soaked pavement of a deserted side street. Before our car had even come to a full stop, two doors of the SUV flew open. Men in dark clothes and ski masks poured out, moving with practiced, brutal efficiency. One of them used the butt of a rifle to shatter the driver's side window. My driver, a loyal member of Jin-woo's security, was pulling his own weapon, but he wasn't fast enough. The sound of the gunshot was shockingly loud inside the car. I screamed. Everything happened in a split second. The attacker was reaching through the broken window to unlock the doors. My own door was wrenched open. A hand grabbed my arm, trying to drag me out into the rain. Something inside me snapped. The fear was a living thing, a cold fire in my veins, but beneath it was a bedrock of pure, unadulterated rage. I was not Sohee. I was not a gentle, kind woman who would be a victim. I would not be his weakness. I kicked out, my heel connecting solidly with the man's knee. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second.
It was all I needed.
My eyes darted around the back of the car. On the floor was a heavy, crystal award from the luncheon I'd just attended. Without thinking, I grabbed it. It was solid, weighty in my hand. As the man lunged for me again, I swung it with all my might, aiming for his head. The crystal connected with the side of his masked face with a sickening crunch. He staggered back, stunned. That was when Jinwoo's people arrived. It was like a scene from a movie. Two sedans screeched to a halt, blocking the street. His men, his real soldiers, emerged with a silent, lethal purpose. The ensuing firefight was short and brutally one-sided. The rival clan's men were outmatched and outmaneuvered. I huddled on the floor of the car, the crystal award still clutched in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When the silence fell, punctuated only by the drumming of the rain, my door was opened again. This time it was Jinwoo. He was soaked, his black shirt clinging to his chest, his hair plastered to his forehead. He must have come from the office the second he heard. His face was a terrifying mask of fury and fear. He knelt by the open door, his eyes scanning me frantically, checking for injuries. Amara, he said, and the way he said my name was different. It was cracked, raw, stripped of all its usual control. He reached for me, his hands unsteady. "I'm okay," I breathed, the words coming out in a shaky gasp.
"I'm okay."
He pulled me out of the car and into his arms, crushing me against his chest. He held me so tightly I could barely breathe, his face buried in my hair. I could feel the violent tremor running through his body. The invincible Kwon Jinwoo was shaking. "When I got the call," he whispered, his voice thick against my ear, "when I saw their car on the security feed, I thought I had lost you, too." It was not a declaration of love. It was something far more potent. A confession. An admission of his deepest terror, spoken aloud. He was admitting that I had become his weakness, the very thing he had sworn he would never allow. I wrapped my arms around his neck, holding on just as tightly. In the middle of a rain-swept street, surrounded by the quiet carnage of his world, I had crossed the line. I had fought back, and he had revealed the truth. He pulled back, his hands framing my face, his thumbs wiping away the rain and tears I hadn't realized I was crying. His eyes were dark with an emotion I couldn't name, a mixture of relief and a terrifying possessiveness. The Choi clan had made their move. They had targeted me, and in doing so, they had not only declared war on him, they had shown him exactly what he stood to lose. The stakes were no longer about territory or business. They were personal. The aftermath was a blur of efficiency. Jinwoo's men cleaned the scene with a chilling precision, erasing the evidence of the attack as if it had never happened. The police, when they finally arrived, were met with a plausible story of a simple traffic accident. I recited the false description of a phantom hit-and-run driver with a calm I didn't feel, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering. I saw Jinwoo watching me from a distance as I lied to the authorities, a flicker of dark approval in his eyes. I had not just survived, I had become an accomplice. I had chosen a side. I had chosen him. Back in the penthouse, the silence was different. It was no longer a barrier but a shared space, filled with the unspoken reality of what we had almost lost. He personally stitched a small cut on my arm from the shattered glass, his movements surprisingly gentle, his focus absolute. He never took his eyes off his task, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. "The Choi family will pay for this," he said, his voice a low growl as he tied off the final stitch. "They crossed a line. They think I'm your weakness," I said, looking at our reflections in the dark window. A woman in a torn designer suit and a man whose tailored shirt was stained with rain and blood. "They're trying to use me to get to you." "They are mistaken," he said, his eyes meeting mine in the reflection. He stood up, turning to face me. "You are not my weakness, Amara." A few days later, a package arrived. It was a simple, elegant box addressed to me. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a single, perfect white orchid, its roots severed. A note lay beside it, with one word: soon. It was a direct threat from the Choi clan, a chilling promise. They knew where I lived. They could get to me. Jinwoo saw the package, and the cold fury that had been simmering beneath his surface for days finally hardened into something lethal. He spent the next 48 hours in his office, planning his response. He was preparing for a war, and he intended to be the one to strike the final, decisive blow. The night he was set to move, he came to my room. I was sitting by the window, unable to sleep, watching the endless stream of headlights on the streets below. "I'm leaving," he said from the doorway. "You will be safe here. I have doubled the security. No one will get through." He was going to leave me behind, locked in this gilded cage, while he went out to burn down the world for me. I stood up and faced him.
No.
He frowned. "This is not a negotiation." "I'm not negotiating," I said, my voice firm. "You're walking into a trap." He went still. "What did you say?" "The meeting point. The abandoned warehouse at the Incheon docks." "It's a trap." My mind had been racing ever since I'd overheard him discussing the location with his lieutenant. The name had sounded familiar. "Before I met you, my father tried to marry me off to Blake Sterling. Blake's company, Sterling Tech, was in negotiations to buy that specific warehouse property. It was part of a portfolio owned by a shell corporation. A shell corporation whose primary investor was Choi Min-jun. Jin-woo stared at me, his tactical mind processing the information instantly. Blake hadn't just been a disrespectful ex. He had been a pawn, a connection between his American business world and the Korean underworld. The Choi clan had been using him. The slap at the party wasn't random. It was a calculated provocation. And this final meeting was the closing of the snare. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his hands gripping my shoulders. His eyes burned with a new, fierce intensity. "How are you certain?" "Because Blake bragged about it," I said. He called it his ace in the hole for cornering the Seoul logistics market. He was working with the choice. He didn't question me. He didn't doubt me for a second. He saw the truth in my eyes, and he knew it was real. He had been so focused on the insult, on the direct threat, that he had missed the treachery hiding in plain sight. I hadn't just given him information. I had saved him. He released my shoulders, turning to bark orders into his phone, his voice sharp and precise. The plan was changed, the trap reversed. He was no longer the prey. He was the hunter once more. When he finished the call, he turned back to me. The look on his face was one I had never seen before. It was raw, unguarded, and filled with a profound acknowledgement. He walked to me, his hand coming up to cup my face. His thumb stroked my cheek, the one Blake had struck. "You are not my weakness," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my queen." He didn't leave me at the penthouse. I didn't go to the docks, but I was with him at the command center, a high-tech office in an undisclosed building, watching the silent drone footage on a bank of monitors. I watched as his men, armed with my knowledge, systematically dismantled the Choi clan's ambush. It was silent, surgical, and absolute. There was no glory in it, only a grim, final accounting. A cost was paid that night. The Choi family ceased to be a threat, their empire crumbling to dust in a matter of hours. The world I came from, the world of polite society and business deals, was gone forever. I had not only accepted this violent reality, I had become a part of its mechanism. My innocence was the price of our victory. When it was over, we returned to the penthouse as the sun began to rise, painting the Seoul skyline in hues of soft pink and gray.
We didn't speak.
There was nothing left to say. He led me to the great window overlooking the city, his city, and now, our city. He stood behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist, pulling me back against his chest. His chin rested on my shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of possession, but of partnership. An anchor in a violent sea. The war was over, but our reign was just beginning. He held me, and we watched the sunrise. He had promised to protect what was his. But standing there, in the quiet dawn, I knew the truth. We had protected each other. And it was a choice I would make again. Every time.